Hi, welcome to Bagel's Binder, where we talk about cardboard. Today we're going over the fundamentals of Magic the Gathering. Maybe you're a new player, or maybe it's just been a while since you last played. Either way, this video will go over some of the absolute fundamentals that you need to at least start the game. So let's take a look at some of the core elements in any game of Magic the Gathering. Obviously, the first thing you're going to be needing is your deck. Now, in most formats, it is going to be 60 cards, though there is some variation depending on what you play. Next up, you're going to need some way to track your health. Now, also in most formats, you start at 20 health, so the most common tool people use to keep track of it is going to be either a notepad or a 20-sided die, of which Magic actually offers in the form of spin-down life counters, which are basically just a fancy 20-sided die with a cool little symbol at the top. Now, it's important to make sure that your deck is properly shuffled, as sometimes after some older games, the cards kind of stick together, and so you end up having a bunch of lands in one section or no lands in this section. It's just ultimately better if you properly shuffle it every time you take it out. Once it's properly shuffled, you then present your deck to your opponent so they can cut it. Now, cutting is essentially just whenever you or your opponent take the cards presented and split them in some way or another. They don't look at the cards, that's not allowed, but they are allowed to shuffle it or simply split it in two halves and then change the order the halves are in, or they might also just tap the top of your deck and say that you're good. Alright, now that you have your health set and your deck is ready, you need to decide who will be going first. This typically comes up to who your opponent is and who you are. Most games will have this decided by a roll of dice, where you might take a 20-sided die and see whoever gets the highest roll, with that person then deciding who goes first. Though I've also seen some games where people use 2d6 or even a coin flip, maybe even rock, paper, scissors. It's totally up to you. Regardless of your method, once you've decided who will be going first, you then need to draw your opening hand. Now, your opening hand consists of the top 7 cards of your deck, of which you are then given the opportunity to do something called a mulligan, where you look at the cards and you say, do I want to keep these? Mulligans consist of taking the 7 cards you drew and shuffling them back into your deck, making sure to break everything up properly. Once that's done, you then present it to your opponent again to have it cut, and then draw the next top 7. If you're happy with this new hand, you're allowed to keep all but one of those cards, with you now having the choice of which of the 7 cards you just drew going to the bottom of your deck. And this could be repeated however many times you feel you need until you're happy with that hand. But you have to keep in mind that every time you mulligan, every time you draw a new hand, you have to put one more card at the bottom of your deck. Now that your opponent has their hand and you have your hand, the game starts. A single turn is broken up into several different phases. Now we're going to be going over all of those phases and kind of what you can do during each of them. The first phase of every single turn in Magic is the Untap Step. During the Untap Step, every card that you have that is tapped or put it on its side is then turned upright, unless something says otherwise. Then you have what is called the start of your upkeep. Now, a lot of cards will probably have triggers at this point, saying something along the lines of, at the beginning of your upkeep, this happens, and this is when those would trigger. Upkeep is also what we here at Bagel's Binder call a shock phase. Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, a shock phase is just any phase in a given turn where you are able to cast an instant speed spell. So, for example, at the beginning of your upkeep, if for some reason you wanted to, you could cast Shock on your opponent's Gilded Goose. Next, you have your draw step, where you would draw the first card of your turn. Now, keep in mind that you can't draw if you are the first person to go and it is your first turn. Now, if you are the second person to go, or if it is anything past your first turn, then you're totally good. You draw every time during this phase. But if you're the first person to go and it's your first turn, you are not allowed to draw. This is also a shock phase. You then have your main step. Now, the main step is where you do just about everything you need to in your turn. On the main step, you play a land, you can cast your sorceries, your creatures, your enchantments, just about anything you need you can cast during your main phase. You can also shock the goose. Once you've played out your turn on this first main phase, you then move to combat. Combat is something of an optional phase where if you choose to attack, or if your opponent chooses to attack, then everything breaks down from there. Or you might just pass and move to the next phase. Now, for this example, let's assume you're attacking with your Runeclaw Bear. First, you will say who is attacking. For this example, you are choosing to attack with your Runeclaw Bear. To indicate this, you will turn your bear on his side, to say to your opponent, this is who I am attacking with. This is also a shock phase. Your opponent will then say, okay, do I want to defend, and if so, who with? So let's assume they had their Gilded Goose here. They might say, I don't want to be hit by your bear, so I will have my goose block for me. This is when they will do something called assigning blockers, which is just a fancy way of saying, this is who is going to be stopping the damage from this guy. This is also a shock phase. Now, once your attackers have been declared, and if they have any, their blockers are declared, you then move to the damage step, where the two creatures will then trade damage. Your creature will deal damage to theirs, and their creature will deal damage to yours. It's important to remember that this is at the same time in most circumstances, meaning even if your creature has more power than your opponent's toughness, if their power matches your creature's toughness, they will both be destroyed. Now, once damage has been dealt, and everything that would die has died, you then move to something called the end of combat, where some abilities will trigger, but generally, you just pass this. But this is also a shock phase. After combat, you then have the second main, which is basically just the main phase part 2, where you are now able to cast the exact same kind of spells you could on the first main phase, just after combat. This might also be called post-combat main phase, or second main. It has a variety of names, but it is, for all intents and purposes, the second main phase. Just as a recap, this is when you can cast your sorceries, your creatures, your planeswalkers, etc. Lastly, we have the end step, the beginning of which a lot of abilities will do something or end at. This is also a shock phase, so shock that goose. Part of it is the cleanup step. It's during this step that your end of turn effects will, end, and you will need to do things like discard down to your max hand size, which is 7. And there you go. That should be just about everything you need to jumpstart your next Magic game. If you liked this video or found it informative in any way whatsoever, make sure to subscribe. Our goal here is to try and teach everybody more about their favorite hobbies, and to possibly introduce them to new ones. You can also check me out on all these other platforms where I play games. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to sleeve your cards.